Hello everyone, today we talk about the Greek Pentekonter and Triakonter warships for our naval units series. These types of ships would require actually much greater introduction. As such, we have never talked about Mycenaean warfare, and even less so at sea, right? So we will get also into the, say, maritime warfare of the Bronze Age, and the reason being that the history of these ships in many ways is lost a bit in the mists of history. In fact, the Pentekonter and the Triakonter were practically the earliest type of Hellenic galleys witnessed, deriving their name from the fact that they were propelled respectively by 50 and 30 oars, naturally and symmetrically divided in 25 and 15 per side, respectively. This types of ships had evolved. We will look at the structure. Today we exemplify the ship as such, like we don't talk about the naval warfare, and if so, just en passant, but it's obvious that we have to make an effort in understanding where this kind of naval technology were stemming from, right? There were even more primitive models of ships that are naturally witnessed with even less oars, but our sources are very vague, after all, both historically and archaeologically. So we have essentially to understand the nature of the ship that had fundamentally, so imagine the Viking longship as such, right? This the Triakonter, the Pentekonter are before the biremes and the triremes came about, but they still survived in the archaic Hellenic period in parallel with these. Because, if anything, they were simpler to build. And the concept of the evolution with multiple rows of oars, right, superimposed, is the one of a much greater aggressive, but also collectively developed training, not just of the crews, but of the same ships with one another, because naturally the taller the ship gets, the more imbalanced it can become. And when you look at the trireme, that was to become fundamentally the standard warship in the heyday of classical Greece, you realize that there was a dramatic cooperation on board between the marines on the deck, the oarsmen, to maintain balance during the maneuvers, during ramming, right? At this time of the Pentekonter and Schwerpunkt, wasn't much ramming around. I mean, it did happen, but boarding was the preferred tactics. And the concept of these early ships that basically take their name, as you understand, from the number of rows of oars, were meant to be sort of much more, say, incursion-style ships. They could be beached quite easily, more easily than the later ships. They still could, as we've seen in different videos about either naval or amphibious warfare, and they were conceived, of course, also for this projection against the enemy ship frontally, for which, as we will see, both for ramming but especially for landing, there was some extra protection on the front for the marines that were at the end of the day the same hoplites or proto-hoplites, actually, if you go back in time. Here I don't add a chronology because the point is exactly this. We're not sure of so many things. There is a beautiful book by the Conway Maritime Press that illustrates the age of the galley, something like that. And if you actually read this period, it's really very confusing. At least also the scholars, the historiography, struggles to define clearly what was going on. We have seen from other videos, such as the one about the Phoenician bireme, how certain developments occurred, how, say, you have a sort of standardization, as it later can be the trireme at a point, because of certain political, military, and social balance of the various communities that were using them, but the experimentation, of course, was happening at so many different levels. There were these type of single row of oars concept of ships just being announced with, say, multiple rows, but all this came at a time that is not entirely clear. It's not well documented even by the classical Hellenic authors, and of course it belonged to a much broader maritime naval culture in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, really, because again, the other peoples were, say, coming with similar, right, with embryonal ideas, at least, if they didn't have the assets to produce ships of a certain kind, because they didn't have so many just to evolve the larger types for being assisted by others, etc. Still, there weren't many ways you could go at sea, right? And even less you could go at war, right, at sea. And so these different concepts overlap. At a certain point, we're not entirely sure of when this was going on. Fundamentally, in the Mycenaean period, we know that the Pentekonter, Triakonter were already there. The idea is the Pentekonter is a bit the bigger, of course, vessel. The Triakonter is a sort of scouting ship, but of course the structure is the same. The in different scale and propelling capacity, but in absolute terms, but fundamentally they can do what also probably smaller types of ships, again, that had also existed. In this sense, naval warfare had been, the more you go back in time, more about the warriors on board than the actual naval structure per se, right? It would remain largely so, because, of course, boarding would remain the main tactics fundamentally during naval warfare. But in these earlier times, what you have is a much more sort of transportation function. I mean, not in a cargo sense, or even for the troops. Naturally, a trireme would have more cargo than a Pentekonter. But the idea is that these things initially served to transport troops, and incidentally just to eventually find at sea with them. It may seem, say, not making sense too much, because you would have had an enemy that was complementary, right, tendentially symmetric, but not the spaces, not the amount of people, right? So these early designs were fundamentally more about the projection of these troops from a place to another across the Aegean and beyond, rather than being designed to engage against one another as the later ones actually would. So the Pentekonter specifically was the standard warship before the trireme, right? And limited numbers of the same Pentekonter remained still when the triremes were around. They were declassed a bit like, the Triakonter had been declassed to act as scouts and dispatch boats because of the aforementioned reason. I mean, there were smaller vessels, and so they can do less against bigger ships, but they can still be more agile. They can, let's say, elude even in certain shallower waters, bigger ships, etc. So this is something that happens over and over again in naval warfare during the various eras. And the designs, of course, are not radically altered. There is a similarity, there is a filiation, right, of the Pentekonter to the bireme, the trireme. And as we've seen, they didn't necessarily even mean much just per se. Say the length of the ship, we will look at the measure of that entailed on a single row, of course. This certain amount of troops were basically 30 meters long, and you would have 25 rows per side. The trireme augments this, right? They have up to 200 oars, but these could still be distributed in a different way from before, also because on the multiple say rows levels you have the particular issue for which you have to be trained of making all these ores files or rows interacting with one another in a functional way. And that's where it gets also more complicated, more costly in general to even train the crews and so on, right? The initial model is much simpler, right? It's sort of Iliad, sort of Trojan type of ship, right? Going straight forward, carrying warriors, landing quickly with some protection. For those that knew that, of course, as soon as you arrive, you would have to immediately land, right? Something very different from the larger fleets of triremes that would have more problems just to move in particular waters. They needed to be more channeled as a whole. They needed more space, more water, and altogether they were also more complex, of course, and costly to move all together. So there is a bit of Mycenaean and individualism and warriorism into this that has, however, been enhanced with the Pentekonter to an important degree compared to the earlier boats to act as a single force on the ship. That had always been true, but now it was increasing in numbers and so also in collective training. For the rest, the technicalities of the sailing, the oaring, were pretty much the same. Like all galleys, a single mast and sail were carried for cruising, right? But all fighting was done under oars, and mast and sail left behind, if possible, before going into action. So this would remain, as we've seen in other videos about classical naval warfare, and it responded to the same exact needs. Sail, the cordage can be set on fire, and just they can't even interfere if there is, of course, wind around. You have what do? You have to, of course, employ the sails. In certain circumstances, it could even happen, right? But normally, the best way to maneuver these ships was, and by far, oaring, right? It was all a specific way of doing that. Already in this early types, we see, of course, that need to balance the ship depending on literally where you distributed the marines on the deck. Of course, the oarsmen collective capacities as well, but it's all much simpler. Both vessels, the Triakonter, Pentekonter, displayed the main constructional characteristics of the Hellenic galley, right? You have three main longitudinal timbers. The timber in shipbuilding is a wooden structural element or a piece of lumber used during properly also the construction. It's a broad term that can include different types of beams, planks, boards, or poles that contribute overall to the structural integrity of the vessel. In this case, it got down to three main ones, and they provided strength, support, stability for the vessel. The first one is forming the keel, right? The other two, instead, the gunwales. Now, the gunwale is essentially the upper edge of the ship's sides. The gunwales act as a protective barrier and provide structural support for the ship. They are essentially the topmost part of the ship's sides. They help to keep water from splashing into the ship. Additionally, they often serve as a platform for crew members to stand on during rowing or combat. And you would be surprised by how much athletic and equilibristic the Marines, and therefore the hoplites in this case, training really was during this combat. I mean, they jump all over during boarding, but just for any kind of tactical necessity, and these structures were designed to support that as well. In the ship's construction, the gunwales were brought down, joining the keel and forming the ram themselves. So all these three timbers swept up at the stern and joined together to form the characteristic scorpion's tail from the back, like pointing onwards. This is quite threatening, right? There is an aesthetics behind the naval engineering that has a lot to do, especially in these terminals, with particular symbolisms, as you know, also at the prow sometimes. Figureheads at the prow that were typically attached to the beak head, right? Projecting the projecting bow area of the ship we will talk about now, and the figurehead itself was usually mounted on the catwater, which is the forward edge of the ship's prow. And they were all meant, of course, to guide, to lead, to really attract divine power in the symbols that they represent, right? So the idea of being nasty, offensive, and sort of rapid, poisonous in the capacity of bringing these troops, making them board your own ship or landing, and raiding around, were all part of the ethos expressed symbolically by the aesthetics of the same naval engineering. The longitudinal timbers were joined instead by ribs at intervals of a bit less than 1 meter, like 90 centimeters, something like that. Give or take, by the way, of course, these ships did follow a degree of standardization in the way that they were built serially, but of course they differed importantly in size, even in some elements of their construction. Well, the aforementioned ribs were carried above the level of the gunwales, and the oars were attached to these ribs by leather thongs, or to separate single thole pins in the gunwale. As we were saying before, naval warfare was sort of less intense as far as the hits, especially that could arrive at the ship during engagements, etc. This was one of the reasons why the rowers still sit in the open in these types of ships. It's likely that their benches were carried across the ship from one side to side to support the central gangway that in the ancient galley refers to this essentially narrow passage or walkway that runs along the side of the ship from bow to stern. We've seen it in the Phoenician biremes that were, in fact, at this point emerging, or would, depending which extreme of the chronology you take. And the gangway was used to access different parts of the galley, including the rowing stations, quarters for officers and crew, and other necessary areas. The gangway allowed the movement along the ship without interfering with the rowers or other operational aspects, and it provided this means for the crew to rapidly move to different areas of the galley during battle or other emergency situations. The gangways here were from bow to stern, in fact, and consider that the ship also had no rudder. You had two steering oars for orienting the ships. You have the helmsman sitting in the stern. He controls the oars by short handles at right angles to the oar. There were other systems, but this seems the most practical. There was also, as we said before, a small foredeck designed for marines for boarding or landing more effectively. As such, the structure was protected by a wicker screen that we've seen also in other ships of the time being used as still some relevant form of defense. There was a ram, right? We have pointed out how ramming was not at this point so say, frequent or sophisticated as a tactic, as a maneuver, as it would be later, but of course was there. Bronze ram, shaped usually also in itself as the head of an animal. The fact that ramming was not much developed still, the guys would smash into the enemy vessels. On some occasions it could be dangerous actually if they pierce with a ram the hull to the point they would remain stuck into it with the enemy ship sinking, but the main point was just smashing into the enemy ship and allowing at that point the Marines to pour on the enemy deck. Actually, this was very complex. We do not know to some extent, even as boarding was actually carried out, for example, by the Marines, that if they managed to flank the enemy ship, of course there were some planks, but we can imagine some harpoons and other means to properly grapple with the enemy ships. So I always remember, from the past, some sort of fantasy-like descriptions on how, the Romans would have been the first ones to use boarding tactics because they had the corvus. Aside from the fact it was it's even debated whether the Romans used the corvus to the extent that we think, and whether they actually won because of that. Important is that they did, definitely. But of course, boarding was there since the dawn of naval warfare, right? Nobody ever, invented that. In a sense, they wouldn't even conceive. You see, we conceive mostly the ship, right? We come from a modern perspective where we are interested in the technology of it. But of course, these soldiers saw these vulgar material means just as a necessary auxilium for semi-gods that had, however, fallen to some degree and needed now this ship to move, let's say, even though still it was because somebody was rowing and this someone was subjected to them and so on, but still as an imperfect way in their individual power that was at the center of this scene. All right, and so especially for Greece, aside from the fact that here we're talking still in part for the late Bronze Age even, but of course this is not much true in the democratistic, modernistic, republican reading of the same Atlantic polis, at least to the extent that we sort of fantasized just in the last couple of 100 years, and especially with a great bias in the last 50 or so. But always bear in mind when you look at these ships what they were designed for as just a mean to an end by people who did something very specific here. When we look at the Pentekonter, let's skip the Triakonter because, we could make an average also for that, but the Pentekonter being the standard warship here, being something like 30 meters in length, having a beam so equally a breadth of 4 meters, and a draft, that is the vertical distance between the waterline and the bottom of the hull, of 76 centimeters, to be particularly picky about, roughly, bit less than a meter. It would have, just by name as we have seen, 50 rows, each with 1 oar. It would reach top speed of 9 knots, that is 18 kilometers per hour. We can approximately count other 10 men on board for a total of 60. And the degree, by the way, which also the rowers could participate to find how they would cooperate with other weapons, etc. It's just something conjectural. We don't have a way to simply measure that, but it's obvious to have been there, right? And it's relevant, of course, to point out as well. The smaller the ship, the older the times, the more directly involved everybody really was, right? The divide between individuals was also less to some extent, or at least, well, of course in Bronze Age you have different things going on. Also this, again, demigods literally being at the head of this world crew, but It's a bit like, in fact, in heroic warfare. You never had literally the individual guy just only fighting. You have these warriors, fighting behind him, but also lots of other lighter troops that you still see and later on, and at the dawn of hoplitic warfare, strictly manned, which are always present. Right? There is no such a thing like an Hellenic phalanx without some sort of missile trooper, horseman, whatever, in spite of the, again, rigid hoplitic model that we sort of designed that never quite existed fully, at least. Of course, it was there, but here we're talking about previous times, right? So it's a wilder time. It's, again, the parallel with Viking long skip that I also made a video on recently is fitting, right? If you wanna think what kind of let's say of course the Pentekonter would be the biggest thing you could have in Viking times. There were larger ships, even as rare as the infrequent, let's say, as they could be. Of course, it's much earlier, more primitive time, but this is in a way the point. I mean, the Pentekonter, the Triakonter were invented in contexts where, say, the society was still warrior-based, right? And very much similar to this idea of, again, just you can imagine Homeric warfare, whereas the triremes come about when fundamentally you have the polis, you have this more egalitarian balance in order, not only because, as we've seen, biremes, triremes were out there also for much more aristocratic powers, and there is in the Mediterranean much of a technical naval engineering standard, right, where especially in the east you see all these peoples having pretty similar, but not identical sort of equipment tending towards that. I made recently a video about the Achaemenid Marines, at least from places like Phoenicia, like Lycia, and Egypt. And you realize that conceptually we're very close, right, to basically what naval warfare was also for the Greeks and would remain for a time. And it's fascinating to think as well, of course, that the Pentekonter would actually remain there, right? It wouldn't be simply surpassed by the trireme totally, right? They would always need to have the simpler types of ships that for any kind of task that seemed useful. And again, the degree of standardization is not so high to the point that you can't imagine so many different vessels like it was in every military context, like having being brought together on the occasion. It is true again that already these populations have, say, for Bronze Age standards, early Iron Age, some more egalitarian balance compared to other peoples. But when it gets to the ships as such, you understand that even for the more aristocratic peoples, the divides between these ships was sort of flattened, because first of all, the bigger one costed disproportionately more, right? The ship is a complex thing, and also just to man, to supply, to upkeep, right, to maintain. But just you want that operational standard, tactical standard, that performance that, after all, responds to specific dynamics that, while similar actually to land battles, are very different at sea. One may think that this is a sort of strange statement to say, because of course, of course, land battles different from sea ones, but let's say tactics were not enormously different. There were battle lines, there was outflanking maneuvers, etc. But it's in that sense, the individual ship that has a different role, of course, from the individual hoplite. Not just because there are multiple hoplites on the ship in turn, but because literally, in fact, they're less wieldy. There are relatively few things you can do with that as well, right? The most famous maneuvers are just basically two, right? There isn't much that you could really invent when all the ships were crammed together and it was just a muscle to muscle on the decks, boarding, etc. Everything would do, but the way you had to handle the ship was again mechanically very specific in itself. So, of course, political, military, and social differences are reflected into this, but when you look at the difference between land and sea warfare, there are different quantities involved, right? By scale, by just vector, if you want, and at similar. So, what is fascinating about the Pentekonter, Triakonter, is the historical context in which they really operated was still before that. The so-called Atlantic Middle Ages, that to some extent didn't even exist. But this is not the video to discuss this. We will talk about Mycenaean warfare. We will talk more about this period. You know that also in the Bronze Age warfare series have been looking pretty much at this sort of time. Again, late Bronze, early Iron Ages. They overlap, obviously, because bronze didn't really disappear, nor iron was immediately just that there was nothing in it exclusively that made it was just the product of different political and military developments, rather, of course, than the other way around, the metal itself, etc. And so it's a delicate time, and on Schwerpunkt we do not discuss it too often, as you know, but over time, like we have began to make more. I haven't created a novel playlist for the Bronze Age, but when you look at Bronze Age warfare, make me check. We made, like, I think pretty interesting 18 videos we made. And they do work, right? They have a sense, they point at a direction, and we have been looking exactly at this critical passage, right? Here we span, because these ships were around from, again, the Mycenaean period. 1300 BC we have the Pentekonter, as far as I understand. And again, this doesn't mean that over the centuries, like, yes, the changes were gradual, but here civilization, by those time standards, was also developing pretty fast. So, of course, there were developments in this Pentekonter, Triakonter times that we can't fully picture, unfortunately. We rely on very few iconographic and historiographic evidence for that. Like, when you talk about primary sources, it's not enough just to be extremely precise, but we definitely have enough to draw pretty interesting pictures, and I'm very satisfied actually with what we have, and I hope we're gonna go on in this, because it really deserves much more, of course, than we have already done. But this was useful, especially for the novel history series. That also want to check. Let's see how much we have. So there is now warfare. Various types of show. Alright. Well, 23 videos. It's not too much, actually. I had made videos about naval warfare since the beginning of Schwerpunkt, but it's just a couple of years that I have increased the the amount of videos specifically dedicated to probably the novel series, the costs, the ship's types, battles, as well tactics we made. Just the Battle of Argunuzai, Peloponnesian War 406 BC. That's a nice video, for example, made. Few hundred views, less than 2 years. It's not much, but when we start making math here, I realize naval warfare has 132 views already. For a playlist, it's not even that bad, considering all the ones I have. So, we grow time by time. Sometimes it's hard. to look at this, say 15,000 videos for 2,000 videos for 15,000 subscribers. It's definitely not this enormous result, but I see there is a sense of community forming. I get encouraging messages, etc. I have ups and downs with the stats because of reasons now I can't descend on in this video. But let's say adding to this naval warfare, I think it's making the channel much more complete than it was. Right? I definitely started with land warfare. I'm not by any means a naval history, naval warfare expert. I'm a landlubber. As all swimmers, I'm not much of a sailor, even though I was about to go in the Navy as a medical cadet. Yet, talking about this stuff, I mean, everything makes sense. Because the beauty of military history, that initially it seems complicated, eventually you understand it's just hard, but it's not complicated. You must make a logical, rational effort to understand where every piece fundamentally is suited, is best suited, and makes sense, and realizing that there is a pattern there, and that following that instinct to some extent, but also just acknowledging that at the end of the day, warfare was very similar, just throughout the ages, so different, but in the same eras, etc. You see again a logic you can gradually follow because you hardly have any brusque change. So everything gets sedimented over time in a bigger picture, which is unfortunately what scholarship doesn't quite care about anymore. And that's why I always say this may seem like a huge waste of time, but actually I think I would never be the military historian I am outside of here if I hadn't made Schwerpunkt. Like, Schwerpunkt told me possibly even more than what, in a strictly military historical sense, than what I did outside, right? Because at least I make military history outside in a very specific and especially tactical way, but I didn't study military history at university. Everything I learned about military history, I learned on my own. Not just on Schwerpunkt, I read really a lot before that. I studied the Kriege, I did lots of other things, but say Schwerpunkt allowed me to enhance this to a level that until again you're not into it, you can't quite understand, right? I would say that this is the most beautiful, the most interesting part of the wall, after all. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.